the Bakken Formation is being developed. These are 1,280 acre spacing units. At the present time, only one's been drilled, as you see down there in the lower left. This is a map of Harding County that shows all of our oil and gas fields. The three fields to the lower left are the gas fields, and the oil fields are all those in the north. Now, another topic that I want to talk about is unitization, and this is especially important for South Dakota, given that over 90% of our oil comes from units. A unit basically is an area that is productive, that's united through a process established in statute that allows bringing together of that productive area so that it can be operated as a single unit, primarily for the purposes of enhanced recovery. Now, enhanced recovery involves injecting, in our case, either air or water into the producing formation to improve recovery. In South Dakota, there are two methods used, and again, both of these are used in Harding County. We have 7 units that employ water injection and 3 units that employ air injection. The air injection is called fire flood. The water injection is called water flood. This is a map of the various units that we have in Harding County. We do have two small, well, actually 3 small units. One is producing in Fall River County. The main units, the fire flood units are in the lower block would be the middle one, the lower one, and the one just to the left to the lower one. Those are called the Buffalo Red River unit, the South Buffalo Red River unit, and the West Buffalo Red River unit. So those are all operated by Continental Resources, and those are fire floods. The remainder are water floods. Next slide is a graph that shows the operators of the various units in Harding County, as well as Fall River County. It shows the operator, the unit name, year of utilization, size of acres, production, and so forth. Now, with unitization, all the mineral owners share in the production, based primarily on a formula agreed to by the owners. The mineral owners are typically referred to as the working interest. And the combined mineral owners are the working interest owners and the royalty interest owners. The working interest owners are generally oil companies that lease the mineral rights that do the development. The royalty owners are primarily the mineral owners that do the leasing to the oil companies, although there is some overlap. As I mentioned previously, to ratify or approve a unit, at least 60% of the working interest and 60% of the royalty interest have to approve the unit before the unit can go forward. Now, the next slide is a graph of the South Buffalo Red River unit. It shows the dramatic increase in production that results from the injection, in this case, of air. And it also improves the overall, not only does it improve the overall recovery, it lengthens the period of recovery. In terms of process, unitization starts by the submittal of an application for an order from our department. It includes various specifics regarding the proposed operation, including the target formation, the legal location, unit operating plans, various agreements, and so forth. Fairly complicated. Most of our newer units now are set up so that wells can be drilled anywhere within the unit as long as they maintain that 500-foot setback from the boundary. Underground injection control. This is related to unitization in that people that want want to inject, for the purposes of enhanced recovery, have to get what's called an underground injection control program. The underground injection control program in our department is actually administered by our sister program, the Groundwater Quality Program. An underground injection control permit is issued for the purposes of allowing the operator to inject while also protecting groundwater resources. Now, this is a federally delegated program. This is not a state program. So we're essentially operating under federal requirements here. There's a single chapter in our rules. You see there's 741207 that applies to underground injection. Again, the goal is to protect freshwater resources. Not only is an underground injection control permit required for enhanced recovery or injection of water or air, it's also required for any operation that re-injects, for example, gas to maintain reservoir pressure. It's also required for the disposal of production and exploration waste. In fact, most of the water generated in Harding County is disposed of through disposal wells under an underground injection control permit. In terms of numbers, we have 122 injection wells permitted in the state. 13 are active saltwater disposal wells. 25 are active air injection wells. 24 are active water injection wells. And the remaining are in various states of either being temporarily abandoned or plugging and so forth. Now, a little bit about our oil and gas approval processes. As you recall, I talked about streamlining some of these processes. The administrative process involves primarily the drilling permit that I talked about before. There are no public notices, there's no public hearing. Those are issued by the department. We generally try to get those out in 14 days or less. We have another process called the notice of recommendation process, and there's an entire chapter in our rules that addresses that process. That allows approval of relatively minor things such as exception locations, modifications to existing permits, and so forth. After the public notice of the Secretary's recommendation, if no one contests the recommendation, the application is approved as recommended. The final process that we have again is the order process. The order process involves spacing, pooling, and unitization. As I explained earlier, House Bill 1012 basically shortened that process, and I think the next slide demonstrates the timeline for those three processes. And the next slide contrasts the current order process and the old timeline. You'll see that it took more than 60 days generally to have an order approved under the old timeline. Under the new timeline, if there is no intervention, we can approve an order in 35 days. Now, a little bit on hydraulic fracturing. In South Dakota, we really don't have the controversial high-volume, high-pressure, multi-stage fracturing that you hear about in the news. We've had some small-scale fracturing, water wells, gas wells, and oil wells in the state for years and years. It's a practice that's been used for decades. The real concern in North Dakota and nationally, where unconventional resources are being developed, involves high-pressure, multi-stage fracturing. In that case, millions of gallons of water are used to fracture a given tight formation, such as a shale unit that contains either oil or gas. They also inject a small percentage of chemicals and either sand or ceramic beads as proppant to hold up the fractures that are created when the water is injected and opens up fractures in the rock. We don't use that in South Dakota. North Dakota, without it, the Bakken Formation would not produce. Actually, oil in the Bakken Formation has been known for more than 50 years, but it wasn't until just recently that they cracked the code that allows the Bakken Formation to be produced, developed economically. As As far as large-scale fracking in South Dakota goes, the only way that that would become a concern in South Dakota is if an unconventional resource is discovered, similar to the Bakken. The likelihood of that is fairly low. The other point I wanted to make is that EPA is currently studying this process, and they're due out with conclusions from that study in the next year or two. They'll determine from that study whether or not they believe fracking should be regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Class 2 UIC program. If they do, because we're a delegated program, we'll probably have to adopt the rules from the feds. Okay, the next few slides are just an update. When I first submitted this presentation, we were in the midst of the work of 3 different committees. As I mentioned earlier, there's a special legislative committee that's studying oil and gas issues. The governor also appointed 2 different work groups to look at oil and gas issues that were headed up by 2 of the senior policy advisors. You can see there on the slide that the governor appointed a development group. Their charge was to look at the potential for expanding oil and gas activities in South Dakota and some of the potential impacts to the environment and other things that might occur as a result of that. The preparedness group looked at various issues related to impacts on infrastructure. As I'm sure many of you have heard, North Dakota is scrambling with trying to keep up with developments in North Dakota. So this group looked at anything ranging from emergency services to schools, housing, trucks, roads, and those kinds of things. The 2 study groups actually completed their work about a month ago. We prepared a 90-page document. The governor's office compiled that. That was presented to the Special Legislative Committee on September 26th. Some of the findings from that report include the Bakken Shale, as I mentioned before, does not extend into South Dakota. The Red River Formation, which is the known producing formation, is our best bet for additional development. We do have other unexplored formations or underexplored formations where there is some potential, but the available data that we have indicates that a Bakken-sized type resource is highly unlikely in South Dakota. As I mentioned earlier, our current oil production is about 1.6 million barrels per year. Under our most likely scenario, that will continue. Development will continue at the status quo pace. That involves about 1 rig drilling about 12 years per 1 rig drilling 12 wells per year. Under the most optimistic scenario, and this involves not only a new Red River discovery, but also one of these unconventional reservoirs, we may see up to 3.2 million barrels per year in a decade, and then rising up to 6.5 million barrels later. That would involve a maximum of 6 rigs operating at any one time. Basically what that tells you is we're never going to be North Dakota. The people working in this area there won't be an influx of oil well workers in this state that will have the impact on this state that the workers in North Dakota have on the state of North Dakota. Therefore, our preparedness activities ought to focus on what's going on in North Dakota. Take advantage of that, but also prepare for the spin-offs. A little bit more about the Special Legislative Committee. As I mentioned, they meet week after next on the 30th. Their staff has put together, based on some of the discussions and meetings that they've already had, some potential legislation that they want to look at. Here are just a few. I saw a memo the other day that included 17 potential areas of legislation. These are the ones that I'm most familiar with. First is the bonding increase. As I mentioned earlier, operators are required to submit bonds. Those requirements were established more than 30 years ago. They haven't been updated. So we looked at some of the neighboring states where bonding requirements have been updated recently, and it's likely that we'll borrow something, or the legislature will borrow something, or the committee will borrow something from one of our neighboring states. Another topic that will likely be addressed in draft legislation will be the requirement that hydrofracking chemicals be reported. Some states have already done this. There's a website that has been developed by the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and the Groundwater Protection Council called Fracing. That's a website where companies can voluntarily report the chemicals that they use in hydraulic fracturing. Some states mandate it. Some other topics that may be addressed include surface damage mediation for surface owners that don't own minerals, annual surface damage payments in the same case. In terms of abandoned mineral interests, there's some discussion about developing a tax deed process that would allow marrying up separate minerals with the surface. Potential impact fund for impacts that where there is no bond. Potential trust fund for the severance tax. And then potential tax incentives for operators to entice them to South Dakota. And that's the end of my talk. You see there the website. There's a lot of good useful information on our website, including production information. You can track cases there. We have a summary of all the cases that are heard by the board or issued by the secretary. Drilling permits, production, it's all that. And with that,
What's that?
Do we need help on how to get to the next PowerPoint presentation here?
Oh, I have to call Nicole and Pierre.